That's because I turned it on. It's that 2020 turn off mute thing. Welcome to this very strange CFO forum, which we decided to have a bit in person and a bit by technology. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet today and pay my respects to their elders past and present. I extend that respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders people here today and wherever they are, and perhaps zooming in. My name's Rona Mellor. I'm the Deputy Auditor General for Australia. Today we'll give you an overview of a number of things, but before we start, it's still a pandemic and in front of you is a glass of water, and if you need another one you need to stick your hand up. That's the rules of the venue. If you need the bathrooms, they're out that door and around behind the screen. At morning tea time, we will give you morning tea in the unusual events that we're in. You either have to sit down or stand up outside. So I'll leave that to you. So many rules to live by these days. We are live streaming. Questions will be asked by live stream if anyone has them, and we'll bring those into the room. And please feel free to chat today. We're not in that room that we usually use that's packed and dark, and I think over at the QT. So hopefully if there's things that you want to talk about even in the break, the team from the Audit Office, the senior team, is here. If you have a question, we'll need to give you a microphone so that the participants outside the room can hear. So what are we going to do today? First of all, I'd like to acknowledge yourselves and all of those in your departments, whether they're departments and agencies, whether they're in your finance teams or more broadly. I think the APS can be proud that we took remarkable steps to step up and assist the community, the government and the Parliament throughout the year. Success brings risk, however. The expectation that you should worry about now and that we as auditors will worry about is that success becomes the normal, and the expectation is that you can do anything really fast. This is going to be a dimension of, I think, implementation delivery risk for public servants going forward because of the success that we've had in doing so much so fast. For us, it's been a year of a bit of the same. Auditing is auditing, and you'll hear today from Carla about what that looked like for financial auditing. And we're pretty happy that financial reporting remains strong. She'll give you the sort of data on some of the watch points, what's been modified, what sort of issues of significance we draw out of the season, and those are the things that we report in our end of year report to Parliament, which will happen in the next couple of weeks. We've had a year of very strong parliamentary interest in our work. What you might not realise is we're very quiet people. We write reports and we table them in Parliament. We don't have a media officer pumping out media releases and back briefing journalists. We just table them in the Parliament, and the Parliament is where we speak. This year, obviously, we've spoken a lot in Parliament on grants, on governance, on land sales, and I suspect there's more of that to come. There's a huge appetite in the Parliament for transparency. The Parliament does with our reports what it does, depending on who's interested in what bits and why. We're finding ourselves briefing a lot more committees and a lot more parliamentarians. I'm not sure if you know that, but before Senate estimates, for example, we will brief committees and individual parliamentarians. There's a high demand for us to explain our work to assist the Parliament. It's also interesting to note that the Joint Committee of Public Accounts and Audit is getting busy. It's got some significant inquiries underway. There's a major inquiry into our legislation and whether it remains contemporary and fit for purpose. It's doing an inquiry into the administration of grants, into the regulatory activities of the Commonwealth, into governance and stewardship of public resources, cyber resilience, and it annually does a review into the major projects report of defence projects. So it's going to be a busy year for audit reports getting transparency in the Parliament in 2021, and probably not unlike this year. You'll know that there's been specific inquiries into some of our work. The sports grants audit had its own select committee. It's yet to report. We've been in front of other committees that we wouldn't normally be in front of, joint committees on the matters that we reported to the Treasurer on ASIC. It's worth remembering that was a report to the Treasurer, not a report to the Parliament, and the Treasurer made that public, and that's how the Parliament's gotten interested in it. And that was derived from financial statements. So some of what you'll hear today is stuff that we're seeing in financial statements that is spilling over into our performance audit work. We have a performance audit on our program about probity in financial regulators, so ACCC, APRA and ASIC, and we'll decide whether to do that as the other mechanisms of review that are going on land later in the year. What do I want you to get out of today? You don't need to take lots of notes. There's lots of slides which you'll be able to see. You're very senior people in your organisations, no matter what the governance structure of your organisations. You're very influential in your organisation in governance, risk management and controls frameworks. We're going to try and pull information together that assists you in taking messages around those key things back into your organisation. We've had, lots of unmodified opinions, as is normal, because of the maturity of the system and the efforts and professionalism that you and your teams bring to your work. But I think I'd like to ask you to ask yourself, in respect of the things we're going to talk about, could that happen here? There are some things we've seen this year that we've called out in various ways, and I think it's sort of in your positions of influence in governance, you should be asking yourselves, could that happen here? It's an opportunity to learn from others by not having to go and talk to them yourself because we've done an audit. I'd ask you to continue to be vigilant in your roles and have the courage to challenge. Some of the things we've seen this year do involve CFOs, maybe not calling things out along the way, whether it's the dynamics of the organisation, the structure of the governance, or someone else is onto it. I know how much reliance I place on my CFO just to keep their ear to the ground for things that perhaps other people aren't noticing. For example, you get, a lot of you through your own jobs or through people who work for you, procurement reports. Are you seeing some companies, consultants, contractors appearing a lot? Does it make you wonder about whether your procurement processes are really competitive? That would be an example of, I see stuff, could I pull stuff together a different way? I'd ask you not to switch off when Lisa, our head of performance audit, stands up and you go, performance audit someone else. Performance audit is all about risk. And this year in particular, you will have seen Leppington Triangle performance audit is something that started as questions being asked in the financial statements and led to a deep dive on the valuation questions. That is becoming our normal. Our staff, our senior people come together to talk about risks, to talk about what they're seeing through audit committees, through their work with you, and that's feeding into the selection of performance audit work. Likewise, the report we made to the Treasurer was something that came out of our work on key management personnel and REM in ASIC. And as I say, we'd had previously flagged a performance audit in there and may well do one. So those huge synergies become quite important for us, but they become quite important for you because we could well come back into your entity and do a deeper dive. Feel free to ask us questions throughout today. We welcome the discussion. And as always, if you want to invite us to talk to your executive, to talk to your audit committee, to talk to your senior executive group, just let us know. We don't have much money, but this is free. This is a free good, our value that we bring. So let's talk about something else that happened this year. I don't know if you're aware that our Auditor General, Grant Howe, has hit the midterm of his 10-year appointment in June this year. And he decided to reflect back. He was the Auditor General of New South Wales prior to that and the Secretary of Treasury in Victoria prior to that. He decided to look back over the 5 years and make observations based on our audit work, so the 250-ish financial statements, the 50-ish other reports we table in the Parliament, and see what the signals were from our work about the health of the public sector in the management of public resources. It's worth noting in that 5 years, I think until this year, there'd only been one qualified audit opinion or audit report. And his view is that the health of financial reporting is very strong, and that's testament both to the frameworks and the professionalism that you and your people bring to that. That report's on our website. You can read it. I'd encourage you to. You can imagine it's full of regression analysis and charts because we love that. But it does tell you by entity, by activity type, where some of the weak spots in public administration are. And here's 4 of them. Some of them might relate to you, some of them might not, but the first one definitely does. In the public sector, our analysis shows that the APS approach to procurement regularly falls short of the expectations in the regulatory frameworks. And this is a really big problem because public service used to do a lot itself and now it does through others. In 1819, expenditure through procurement was $64.5 billion. And a lot of work has gone into establishing the frameworks to manage the risk within that process. You may not have had a performance audit in procurement in your entity, but I think that it's worth noting the Auditor General saying here it could happen to you. Not an audit could happen to you, but the lack of achievement of value for money as the government policy requires might be happening to you. So it's a really important watch point. It's really important. Are you aware about whether people who are doing procurement in your organisation are appropriately trained? Is all the guidance in your organisation up to date? Are you getting strange questions from those teams that send alarm bells off for you about, oh, it sounds like they're trying to cut a corner here? People cutting corners is one of the big risks, whether it's in probity, in conflict of interest management, in the tender evaluation itself. So I think it's a really strong watch point for people in the influential roles that you have. Regulation is another area that's falling short. The Auditor General notes that regulation is crucial for a proper functioning civil society. Organisations that conduct regulation of businesses or citizens are given extraordinary powers. What do we consistently see? That the risk management approach is not necessarily tidy in there, and people can't necessarily explain why they do this and not that. So Parliament gives them all these powers and they don't seem to have a really good strategy or measurement over what they're doing. Indigenous policy is, the analysis of audit results shows there's much more to be done to improve the delivery of service to Indigenous Australians. It's just worth noting that Indigenous performance audits, it has the highest number of negative findings. These are many, many findings that go to, and again, lessons for others, setting measurements about what you're doing and are you getting there, not just doing the job. There's no doubt that people who work in Indigenous service delivery work hard, but do they know whether what they're doing is having the impact that the government intends? And with the billions of dollars that the community invests in these activities, people doing it need to measure. It's also worth noting that Indigenous entity financial audits have the highest number of findings as well. So there's real governance and financial management and financial reporting issues in there. Cybersecurity continues to be one of the things that we, almost in disbelief, can't see real traction and improvement on, despite the fact that the mandatory top 4 has been in place for 6 years. So 6 years ago, the government said, you've got to do the mandatory top 4. And for those that aren't covered by that policy, what we've noted, and so that would be the corporates and some others, that people have adopted the mandatory top 4 but still haven't delivered it. And yet all of the signals from government and from experts is that in the digital economy, this is our highest risk. We consistently find in the controls work that we do, what you will know as the ITGCs, the IT General Controls work, there are always findings. Really simple things like monitoring privileged access. Who's looking at the stuff that you've got? Do you know who they are? Do you onboard and offboard them? So really simple things that can undermine the integrity of your systems. Consistently negative findings in performance audit. And one of the things we note is that other than the audits done by the Auditor General, the regulatory framework inside the public service is almost a vacuum. So yes, it's completely consistent with the PGPA Act that accountable authorities are responsible for the implementation of policy, but the Parliament's not getting a view of risk and exposure and how well it's being managed. So that's a big watch point for you and for your organisations. On the whole, we do things well as well. The things on the left of the screen, policy development, grants administration, asset management, service delivery, governance, regulatory and procurement, are the activities that we classify when we audit. So they're the public administration things that the public service does. And what you can see is that policy development, when we audit it, we see public servants do a really good job. They gather evidence, they write advice. We don't measure, we don't call policy when it's, oh, that's a good policy. What we're looking for is the process of the development of the policy effective? And on the whole, it's not too bad. The converse, of course, is procurement. We see those in the legend unqualified, largely, partially and adverse. They're the sort of opinions groupings that we put in conclusions in audit reports. And what you can see there is that partially effective is the most often call in procurement. So if you went to the website and got this report, you could look at the sort of charts that we've got in there and say, could that happen here? Is that where we are? The things, as a Deputy Secretary, I'd look down there and say, wow, have we got our governance settings right as an organisation? Are they robust? If we're a regulator, let's have a look at some of the things that the Audit Office is saying. Have we got those right? What else is in the report? Well, we do a leaderboard by department. That's always fun. And why is that? Because we cut our data in many ways. So these are mostly what we call the control entities, or these are the sort of central departments where the appropriations go, if you like, with a little bit of texture around them because mogging happens, etc. And you can see that Foreign Affairs is doing okay. And as I said before, you can see Prime Minister and Cabinet in its Indigenous delivery mode is not doing so well. It's also worth having a look. If you're from a portfolio entity, we don't see much difference in the tone in the portfolio entities from the portfolio and department. Performance reporting. So where are we looking at? The Auditor General in his midterm report not only reflects back on the last 5 years, but projects about where does the public service, in addition to building those capabilities behind those areas, where does the public service need to go? I wouldn't call performance reporting a new frontier. Let's think about it. PGPA Act started in 2014. It has a whole set of requirements. The PGPA rule and the RMGs have a whole set of requirements and guidance about performance reporting. I'm looking at the age profile of this room, and many of you pre-exist the PGPA and know that there has been performance reporting in the public sector and in the private sector for decades. When we do performance audits, we do look at whether or not the KPIs are robust, they fit the frame, are they relevant, reliable, do they link to the purpose? And we also look at the evidence that's used. You know how in your performance statements in your organisation will say met? Yeah, good luck. We'll go and have a look and see whether it really is. Now in your jobs, you're used to, and we see this through the quality of financial reporting, you're used to having a framework, having evidence, having processes that assure you that when you put a set of financial accounts in front of your accountable authority, you're pretty confident that the accountable authority can sign them off as true and fair. We're not sure it's that good in performance reporting, and I think there's a really good opportunity here for CFOs and leaders in the financial framework to influence in their agencies the development of good processes for performance reporting, because performance reporting is an emerging key focus. We've already done 34 performance audits on the PGPA, PMRA framework. Lisa will talk to you shortly about where we're going with performance statements. Performance statements, as you know, get included in the annual reports that are tabled by your accountable authorities through your minister. And the Parliament doesn't get assurance over performance statements now in the same way they do over your financial statements that the information is reliable. And so we've developed approaches, and Lisa will fill you in a bit more on those. I guess what I'm saying to you is you live in a world of professionalism, of structures, of framework. You know what it takes to underpin the development of clean accounts. What can your colleagues say in the corporate governance area, or I don't know what areas they call them anymore, but the people that do the planning, the corporate planning, and then the reporting, how do they get through processes good assurance that when they stick a performance statement in front of the accountable authority, that it's reliable? You already do that. I'd reach out a hand and give them a bit of a help. I think this might be the last area, and this is probably the one that's the most annoyanced and may freak a few people out. You know that in the PGPA Act, the proper use of resources is defined to include effectiveness, economy, efficiency and ethics. And for those of you that have been around in the public sector, you know that the Audit Office mostly focuses on effectiveness. We do have methodology to do efficiency, so we go in and say, I don't know, we most recently did the Commonwealth Director of Public Prosecutions, unpicked all their business processes and looked at whether or not there was efficiency in the processes. We have methodology for that. The Auditor General flags in the midterm report that we don't feel it's sustainable to not build a methodology around ethics and start looking at the ethical use of public resources. This is new territory, and we're not alone as a Supreme Audit institution in the world in doing this. We're watching our colleagues in New Zealand very closely because it's an area of focus for them. I'd have to say, as a CFO, I'd be thinking about it because we also have two sets of legislation in the Parliament, one by an independent member and one by the government on a Commonwealth Integrity Commission. And this notion of ethics and integrity has become quite the debate in the public discourse, in the community and in the Parliament. Ethics is more than conflict of interest and probity. We already audit in those areas around frameworks. Frameworks exist, you put in place in your agency's requirements in procurement, in grants management, in all sorts of ways, even with your senior executives that have to make declarations of interests on an annual basis under the Public Service Act. Ethics for us is really looking at the intent of the framework and the law. What we've seen and been uncomfortable about over a number of years is people skating close to the line, trying to do things that are convenient for them, but not necessarily with the intent of achieving proper management of public resources or proper stewardship of public resources. And so we're building a framework of methodology to audit against that. But there are frameworks that already exist. The APS Commissioner's directions, Section 14 of his latest directions sets out in a statutory way ethics, and this within the code, if you like, and the Department of Finance in its glossary around the PGPA Act puts expectations around ethics more clearly. I guess if you wanted to have a look at at an audit where we've called ethics out, it would be the Leppington Triangle. You might have thought about that as an audit about the valuation of land. You might have sat there and said, could that happen here? I'd encourage you to have a look at that audit from another perspective, and that's where the Auditor General has called out behaviour which he concluded fell below ethical standards. I know that that was quite different for the department. We had many conversations about it. But I guess I'm flagging you can expect to see more of it as we develop more thinking about it. And again, in your jobs, I wouldn't be afraid to say, is that ethical? Is that ethical? Some of the things that we've seen in the financial statements around KMP, you'd argue probably fall into that class. The last thing I'd say, I just want to flag with you about recommendations. We do get a bit of a laugh on recommendations because on the whole people agree with them. You can see that, you can see the departments that have had a lot of recommendations. Home Affairs has had a lot of recommendations. It gets a lot of audits. It's a really, really big department. It does a lot of stuff. And as you go down, you'll see that we've coded there how many recommendations they got and how many were fully received. One of our benchmarks of a good audit report, and we see this in the financial statements world, these are performance audits, see this in the financial statements world is the following up of recommendations. It's fair to say that the land valuation in infrastructure, some of the recommendations that were made in that financial audit weren't followed up, and that piqued our interest the next year. But I'm guessing that on the whole, mostly you follow up the recommendations because it's an iterative process and we agree to things and we make findings and recommendations and you follow them up. In performance audit, two interesting dynamics to pull out. One is that people agree to recommendations, but then they write this huge blurb. They don't just go, agreed. They write this huge blurb about how they've already done it. Well, no, these are assertions and they haven't. Or the blurb disagrees with the recommendation. We've decided to go back into every portfolio on a cycle, so I think we're about to table defence, and go back in and have a look at the governance around the implementation of recommendations and whether or not things that are being closed in the department are evidence-based. It's fair to say that ANAO recs get a good run over in your audit committees and your internal auditors keep an eye on things. But it is also fair to say that if the recommendation comes from the Parliament, everyone goes, not me, not me. And particularly recommendations coming out of the Joint Committee, which tend to be administrative, and people do, you have a response requirement to the Joint Committee. So we use a couple of reports that come out of the Parliament. The presiding officers make a report once a year on parliamentary recommendations that have been made in the year and what their status is. So we use that to guide us as well. In your influential roles in governance, if you've got recommendations from the ANAO, obviously you might have some from internal audit or other management reviews as well, don't let them go mouldy. You're much better off through your governance process saying this is no longer relevant because we've had a lapsing measure, we're not doing that anymore, things have changed, we've been mogged, this one we're handing over here. Manage them. We're nerdy. We will come back and look. And it's a signal about how actively people manage important things in their governance. So if you agree to it, do it. Put in place good governance around it. If things change, manage it through the governance. Again, a watch point, I think, for people like you, many of whom would go to your audit committees very regularly, sit on the management structures and boards of governance in your organisations. It's a watch point. Of course, we score them. If you want to see a leaderboard, health gets on and implements things. We've got a lot coming out in health because of COVID this year. We'll see how they go in the future. Infrastructure, it's not in its happiest place, is it really? It's again another signal. is governance working in an organisation effectively? So I'd encourage you to have a look at the Auditor General's midterm report, just to see how, when you sort of just a bit outside the system and you've got all this evidence and the frameworks that we look in, what they tell us about health. And I'd encourage you, as influential peoples in governance structures in your organisations, to have some of these things in mind, to have the courage to challenge, to have the courage to look into what's happening in your organisation and help your accountable authority not end up at the bottom of the chart, pretty much. That's all I was going to say. I'm very happy to take any questions before I hand over to Carla. All good? Oh, thank you. I'll just get you a microphone so that our external guests can hear.
So David from the DTA.
Hi, David.
I have the joy of looking after both performance reporting and financial reporting.
Oh.
Is there one thing you've found in performance reporting, because it's new to me, that we should be looking out for?
I think, and Lisa will have probably some additional views, I think that I would say, and I'd say this as a person who was a Deputy Secretary in your sector for 10 years before I came to the Audit Office. First of all, I'd say that your KPIs must link to your purpose. They can't be some random thing that you think the minister might like. They need to actually be things that you can deliver. The second thing I'd say is that you need to think about, when you whack them into your PBS and put them in your corporate plan, that you know how you're going to measure them. What we find is at the end of the year, people scramble around and go, oh, did we actually do that? How are we going to do that? We did an audit in Foreign Affairs a couple of years ago, where Foreign Affairs was using case studies to demonstrate the achievement of KPIs, but they chose the case studies at the end of the year with a little bit of a bias in them, rather than thinking about the evidence that would actually demonstrate the achievement of the KPI. I'd also think about how many KPIs does your organisation really need to demonstrate its performance to the Parliament. One of the things that we saw when we started on this journey of building this methodology was how many KPIs some people had. Some agencies have got like 90. Do you really need 90 to demonstrate against your outcomes what it is that you're spending your money on achieving under your purpose? So I think there's some learnings. One of the things we're thinking about doing in the new calendar year is convening a group of people. You'll be able to come, even though you've been at this one, of the people who are involved in the planning and development of the performance statement, and talk about the lessons learned along the way. But it's a new framework at some levels, it's not new at other levels, and I guess as CFOs, you know what goes behind the number that goes in the accounts. What I'm saying to you is teach the others, you'll have to learn from yourself, what is it that we know that we need to do to report on this at the beginning of the cycle, not when it's too late. The other thing is that corporate plans can be changed throughout the year. I'd have a serious think about changing my corporate plan in May and then having to reconstruct my performance statement. Lisa has been through that this year, where an entity decided to completely revamp their corporate plan within the current year, not put it out in their next one. And it made it almost impossible for them to demonstrate that they'd met their KPIs. But I think the forward planning and the thinking about how are we going to measure this? Let's gather the information through the year. Let's use our audit committee and our assurance process if this evidence supports it, before we put met, agreed, yes, no, tick, whatever people do in their performance statements. I think that's, you can cover some more. You'll need a microphone.
Yeah, no, I think that covers the things that
Cool, thank you.
Anyone else before? Yes, the one up the back there. Maureen? Good on you, Sam.
Sorry, Ashley from National Blood Authority. I was just curious, you put up I think there was 5 in the list of key themes raised by the Auditor General.
Yeah.
I would be extraordinarily surprised if you went back 40 years and they weren't exactly the same themes.
I would too.
Which I don't actually think it well, sorry, I'll rephrase that because I actually said my name.
We got it at the door.
I don't actually think it adds a lot of value by just putting up the themes. I think you've got to get towards solutions to why we see the same things appearing for the last 40 years.
So I could spend an hour telling you that, or you could read the report.
No.
I think, what would I say? I'd say yes, some of them would recur, absolutely. And if I took procurement, what I'd say is that what we see is more and more people using the how to get out of it rather than how to manage within it. And as I opened with, I wonder if it's a time pressure thing.
Yes and no, but I think in terms of how to get out of it, etc. I think then what's the issue that you're addressing? But the other one that I was actually interested in is with the 4th E in terms of,
yep.
Well, can you really codify in a legal way ethics?
Well, the Public Service Commissioner has. So, and that's part of his statutory responsibility. And I guess, can we develop a methodology that unpicks that? I'm pretty confident we can.
Okay.
Yeah, I think, what would I say? There will be judgment in it, as there is in auditing. It does involve professional judgment. We don't make up the frames. We don't make up the CPRs. If I was finance and I was seeing procurement continually up there, I'd be asking us, what is it that's always happening? They do. Should we amend the rules here because they're not fit for purpose anymore? The same with grants. The grants rules have been amended this year on the basis of audit findings in relation to ministerial transparency. For the ethics issue, I think it's going to be a difficult one to bring into the auditing frame because it will involve a lot of judgment. But we tend to be very framework based. We also sometimes in our reports make findings that go to the thematic of the report, not necessarily the conclusion. And I expect as we develop our druthers on this, we'll report things and let the Parliament make the call, because the Parliament passed the Public Service Act and it owns the integrity of it. So what we do is report. We don't make up the rules, we audit against frames. So I take your point that it's going to be a challenging piece, but we feel that that's the frame that the PGPA Act gives us to audit under. Proper use of resources does involve ethics. I think, as I said, with the prospect one way or another of an Integrity Commission in the Commonwealth, it's going to be something that's expected of public servants to have a higher regard to. Alrighty, if that's it, and we'll be around, I'll welcome Carla Jago, the Head of Financial Audit.
So good morning, both to those in the room and those watching online. I'm going to run through this morning a summary of our end-of-year report to Parliament and some of the themes coming out of that. It hasn't actually tabled yet. We're expecting it to table in mid-December, so I'm not going to talk names of entities or anything like that, just themes and numbers. This is the second report we do each year. So back in, I think it was June when we last spoke to you, I spoke about the report we tabled in May that dealt with the largest 24 entities. This report deals with all entities that we audit. So the key results, and I'll run through some of these in a bit more detail in further slides, but up to the 24th of November, we'd signed actually 231, not the 229 that's up there, two more I found out about overnight, 231 of the 246 mandated audits that we need to do. And that includes the CFS. So we actually, the Finance Minister signed the whole of government accounts, the CFS, on Tuesday of this week, and the Auditor General issued the auditor report on Tuesday as well. Out of those, we've had one modified auditor's report, and that related to revenue recognition, and 5 emphasis of matters, and they've mainly related to issues around prior period errors, material uncertainties around asset valuations in the COVID space, and going concern. 77% of our auditors' reports were issued within 3 months of year end, and I'll show you a bit more detail on that in the next slide. Our audit findings, so as you're aware, we categorise them into significant, moderate and minor, A, B and C. So there were 142 of those compared to 184 last year, with the main drop being in the category Cs in the IT area. Again, I'll talk to you a bit more about that in a little bit. We also considered the COVID-19 pandemic's impact on entities, and it was really pleasing to see that all entities had actually reassessed their risks in the COVID space. So that was very positive. For the entities where we report key audit matters, so that's the entities that are in that report we tabled in May, the COVID-19 pandemic actually resulted in 5 entities having revisions to their key audit matters, and 3 entities that actually got new key audit matters just because of the impacts of COVID. The report will also include a summary of some work we've been doing in 3 entities around the management of staff leave, and I'm going to spend a little bit of time on that in this presentation because I think there's some learnings in that for all entities. In terms of the audit report signings, so we'd signed 77% within 3 months. Now, that is a bit less than last year. So last year we had signed 83% within 3 months. While we'd always prefer it to be higher, I think given the circumstances we were all operating in, 77% is pretty good. And I'd like to thank all of you and your teams for your focus on keeping financial reporting going and supporting the audit teams through that process, including giving the teams remote access to help us keep the audit work going, particularly on the large audits. We did issue 94% of our auditors' reports within 2 business days of the financial statements being signed as well. That's not shown on that slide. A little bit on the audit findings. So this year we had 2 significant, 22 moderate and 118 minor findings. So as you can see, slight change in the significant and moderate numbers, but quite a big change in the number of minor findings. The 2 significant findings relate to payments to key management personnel and related procurement issues, and corporate governance arrangements to do with board arrangements, human resources and procurement. Similar to prior years, 77% of the moderate findings relate to IT controls, particularly user access and privileged users, compliance and quality assurance frameworks, and management of non-financial assets. So these are consistent with prior years. The IT control environment one looks at IT security management, which is where the access management and privileged user management, including logging and monitoring, comes in, as well as configuration settings around password controls, IT change management, data centres, network operations, backup and recovery processes. So in that space, we had 7 new moderate findings during 1920 and still have 1 moderate finding from the prior year that's open in that category. 6 of those 8 new findings relate to privileged user access monitoring. So it is really still the space where attention needs to be kept. 4 of the moderate findings relate to weaknesses in user access management, but IT security is the largest area of weakness, so 65% of our findings relate to that area, and it's 88% of the moderate findings. So that IT space and IT controls really is an area that everyone needs to keep on. We also look at significant legislative breaches, or what we call L1 findings. You'll see it's quite up and down by year. So we had 3 last year, we're down to 1 this year. That 1 this year is a carryover from a number of prior years, an issue that hasn't yet been addressed in terms of the entities legislation. We also look at the quality of financial statement preparation. So in 1920, we had no significant, 4 moderate and 10 minor findings in the space of financial statement preparation, compared to 1819, where we had 1 significant, 4 moderate and 15 minor. So a reduction in both the significant and the minor findings in that space. Timeliness has remained fairly comparable to the prior year. So while there was a bit of a dip in the 62% of financial statements on the agreed timeline compared to 69% last year, when I look at those that come within a week, there was a further 28% that came in that week. So that takes us to overall 90% delivered on the agreed date or within a week of that, compared to 87% last year, which again, given the circumstances, I think is a good achievement. We did look at adjusted and unadjusted differences. So this year there were unadjusted audit differences. There were 100 unadjusted differences, and 63 of those related to material entities. That's a bit higher than last year, only 52 of them related to material entities last year. While the number dropped, so the number of unadjusted differences dropped from 120 last year to 100 this year, the value of the unadjusted differences actually went up. So they went up pretty well across the board. There was one entity in particular that caused most of the increase, but when we look at the unadjusted differences across the board, they did go up in value, which is something we all need to keep an eye on. We also this year had the implementation of new accounting standards, so primarily leases and revenue. What we found with leases was Department of Finance had put a lot of guidance out. They put out a model to help entities. They ran sessions, and entities on the whole produced really good position papers in relation to leases. And what we found was that actually allowed issues to be addressed earlier, and we didn't have as many issues at year end around leases as we thought we may have. If I compare that to revenue, we didn't see as many position papers prepared around revenue, and we probably had more issues at year end around revenue recognition under the new standards than we did around leases. So I think it really brought home to us the importance of those position papers early in the year, so we can collectively agree on a position and work through any issues. We also again looked at financial sustainability, so we do this in the report each year. Department of Finance has put out some ratios through transparency.gov.au that any users can go and look at. We put our own, parameters around those to try and work out, what's a large surplus, what's a large deficit from a balance sheet, what's strong, what's weak, and do some analysis around that. So in terms of the operating surpluses and deficits, 29% of not-for-profit entities recorded a large average deficit, and 29% of for-profits, 27% of not-for-profits had a large average deficit. 16 not-for-profit entities had a large average surplus. They were mainly appropriation-funded entities whose activities really dropped off following the COVID-19 pandemic, so they just didn't have the expenses. That seems to be where the large surpluses are coming through. In terms of the analysis of balance sheet strength, we did have to make some adjustments to what we considered a strong and a weak balance sheet compared to the prior year because of the impact of the leases standard. So that did have an impact on the liquidity and gearing ratios that we looked at. So when we reviewed those across government, we felt there were 53% of entities with strong balance sheets. That is a bit of a dip to the prior year. Some of that does relate to the leases application. The entities with weak balance sheets, on the whole, tended to be entities dependent on government policy for continued funding. So it's something that the Parliament will need to consider in terms of the future funding of those organisations. We also looked at the impact COVID-19 had on financial sustainability. There were actually 8 entities that were quite significantly impacted by COVID-19, and in order to show that they were a going concern, either needed additional funding, they had to get letters of support from a parent entity or the government to say they would get funding, or they actually had to restructure their operations. Those entities were predominantly in industries or operate in relation to industries that were affected by COVID-19, including aviation and tourism. Out of those 8 entities, 7 of them got an unmodified auditor's opinion. 1 of them had unmodified auditor's opinion, but an emphasis of matter around material uncertainties related to an asset valuation. That valuation was done on a discounted cash flow basis. They run a hotel. They had no people at the hotel for quite some time, and it wasn't clear when they would get tourists back. So there were uncertainties around how that valuation was constructed. A little bit more on IT controls and cyber security. So we had a look at, again, how the COVID-19 impact affected agencies in this space. It does remain a high priority of the government, and the Department of Home Affairs have actually released the Australian Cyber Security Strategy, which highlights the importance of protecting Australia's information online, and particularly during the pandemic. So we identified that 84% of government entities, or 186 of the group we were looking at, utilised remote working arrangements during the COVID-19 pandemic. The majority of entities assessed that they did not need to change anything in their existing IT controls to enable that to happen. 15 of the 186 entities we looked at in this space actually did need to change their IT controls to enable that remote working to happen. We also had a look at how entities had assessed their exposure to cybersecurity intrusions during this period. That was done by 105 entities, that assessment. Of those 105 entities, 74 didn't identify any additional threats due to the COVID-19 pandemic, and the remaining 31 identified at least one new threat, some of them more than one. The most common new threat identified was relating to phishing scams. So 45 of the 222 entities we looked at in this space reported an increase in the volume or frequency of cyber intrusion attempts since March 2020. So that's a fairly reasonable proportion. And as I mentioned earlier, IT really is an important area. We had 8 moderate and 40 minor findings this year in the IT space. Now, pretty well for the rest of my time, I'm going to run through with you some things on the management of staff leave, some additional work that we did across 3 entities. We did some interim reporting on this in the report we tabled in May, and then there's further analysis in this report. So this chart we actually included in the report in May, so it has entity names on it. So Department of Home Affairs, Prime Minister and Cabinet and Treasury are the 3 entities that we did this work in. What this shows is the proportion of leave that should be pre-approved, so annual leave, long service leave, study leave, that type of thing. The light blue is showing the proportion that were not actually approved in advance of the leave being taken, and that was quite a bit higher than we had expected, those percentages. We had a look at annual leave. And one piece of analysis we did was to look at 3 dates, so the 1st of July 2018, 30 June 2019, 31 December 2019. And when we looked at those dates, the number and percentage of staff with excess annual leave at just one of those dates ranged from 117 staff in one department up to 1,203 in another. So that's between 7.9 and 14.4%. If we looked at those that had staff that had excess annual leave at 2 consecutive dates, it ranged from 70 staff to 638, so 4.2% to 5.6%. So there's obviously some work that can be done in managing annual leave balances. We also identified some compliance issues around purchased leave, around long service leave, maternity and parental leave, and personal leave. They were mainly around policies that entities have put in place just not being followed in a number of cases. So it might be that medical certificates are meant to be retained. We couldn't find the medical certificates and neither could the entity in a number of cases. It might be for long service leave. There are rules around how you can and can't break long service leave. They weren't followed in a number of cases. So when the report comes out, I'd encourage you to have a look at that to see some of the areas that we found non-compliance. We also had a look at the proportion of personal or sick leave that commenced on certain days of the week. So this isn't the only day of the leave, but what day the leave commenced. The green line through the middle are basically the available work days. So we've taken out public holidays and shutdowns. The three blue lines, which are almost identical for the three agencies, show you the proportion of leave that starts on each day. And you'll see there's a disproportionate number that start on a Monday, and actually quite a dip on a Friday. I'll just let you have a think about whether that might be something you want to have a look at in your entities, and whether there's anything that can be done to manage that. We did also have a look at flex leave, which a lot of entities have. There's quite a range in how entities have set flex leave up. We actually found between 4.9% in one entity up to 17.6% in another entity where staff had either excess credits or debits in their leave. The highest flex credit balance we found was 705 hours, and the highest debit balance was 57 hours. We also identified in one entity some EL1s that had been accruing and using flex for some time when they weren't actually entitled to it. We had planned to look at attendance records, so we were going to try and use network access records, physical swipe card access, and try and marry that up to leave records to see if there were any days where people didn't seem to be at work and there was no leave form. We have not included the analysis of that information in the report because we found some issues with the data. There is some information in the report around the issues we found. What I'd suggest you have a think about for your entities is how many days is your network access data retained, and what might you need that for? Do you need it retained for longer? Do staff actually log off the network each day? We found in one instance, even though the policy was they should have been, they weren't. So we couldn't actually use network access data because you couldn't use log-on data because that showed what day they first logged on, not how long they'd been on for. Causes some security issues as well. Under the PSPF, you are meant to log off and shut down your computers each evening to prevent cyber intrusions. There's also a number of staff in some organisations that don't actually require network or physical access, so how can you use analysis like this in those types of scenarios? So given the insights we've got from this work, I'd challenge you to consider in your entity these questions. So are staff actually entering leave before taking it? Very hard to manage your work that needs to be done if you don't know whether your staff are going to be there. Are staff entering their leave as soon as they return for sick leave, bereavement leave, the types of things you can't predict? Are staff recording leave when they're not at work? Who's actually checking that that happens? We found in the three entities there's a lot of reliance on individual managers. There's not much overarching reporting or monitoring happening at all. And is leave managed and taken in compliance with your entity's policies? Lastly, moving forward, few things that I wanted to mention. As I said before, we really appreciated the remote access we had to a number of your entities. We're going to keep trying to use that and would look to expand that where we can. KMP remuneration and expenses, Rona mentioned something on this, but I think it's worth every entity thinking about who's actually oversighting that. Who's approving the accountable authority's expenditure? And is that the right person to be approving it? If the person that's approving that expenditure is someone that reports in a line sense to the accountable authority, will they really challenge what's being put forward? Would a more suitable person maybe be, if you've got a board, the chair of the board? If you don't have a board, maybe the chair of the audit committee. Unusual transactions and what your responsibilities are. So I would encourage you, if you see something that doesn't look quite right, to actually ask some questions and investigate. It's amazing the number of people that come to us after they've left a job to tell us about things that they thought they didn't like doing in their previous job that might have been a bit dodgy, but they did nothing about it while they were in the job. We also get a lot of, I'll call them informal things that are told to us by family, friends, acquaintances, because they seem to think telling us means we get to do something about it, but they're not willing to take it through any other channel. So I'd really encourage you to be aware and look out for unusual transactions and look into them if something doesn't look right. I mentioned before the benefits of position papers. We've really seen that with leases, so I would encourage you with new standards going forward to do early position papers. agreeing early with your audit team the timing and how you're going to review key estimates, particularly with the impacts of COVID-19. If you've got estimates that rely on the recoverability of debt, that could be impacted by the economic conditions, try and get onto that early. There is a new auditing standard this year on auditing accounting estimates, so you may get some extra questions from your audit teams around this, because a big part of the standard is really understanding what management's done in terms of pulling together and understanding the estimate. And then lastly, making sure we all collaboratively agree responsibilities, timelines, and stick to those throughout the year. That was everything I was going to cover. Happy to take any questions.
It's not actually, sorry.
Sorry, unfortunately I've got a few. I think you raised earlier in the, very early about, I think you had procurement in terms of where issues were raised. It also included...
Oh, that was one of the Category A findings?
Yeah.
Yep.
So I'm just curious, because it actually doesn't tease out what the issue was.
No, and that will be in the report when it's tabled.
And I understand that. But is this about the controls framework? What's the issue relevant? So I think...
Controls that should have been in place that were not followed.
Correct. That's the sort of thing that actually helps the advice and the discussion.
Yep. So that detail will be in the report.
Unfortunately, I have limited time as a CFO to read 500 pages probably.
Read chapter 2 of the report and you'll get what you need.
So in terms of KMP remuneration, and you drew out a very good point about accountable authorities, remuneration/expenses. Where is the guidance on where that should be provided? So what we're looking for is guidance. Someone should provide guidance on accountable authority expenses or/remuneration. Who should sign it off? Where does that sit? Because I'm yet to see it.
APSC or finance may decide to provide guidance. I think it's just a general controls consideration about who is best placed to do it.
So there was I'm just putting the question out there. Where is the guidance provided to agencies/departments on that space?
So there's a lot of agencies that do already use, say, a board chair or an audit committee chair to do that role.
Yeah.
Yep.
You raised the points about the Mondays to Fridays in terms of things. So are you stating that you don't believe the records are correct?
No, this is the data. What we're saying is that something you might want to look into in your entities around whether that's, are there any things you can put in place that might change that?
So, but that's a different question to saying that the records for leave are incorrect.
I didn't say, if I did, I did not mean to say that. I did not say the records for leave are incorrect. That is purely based on the HR records. That's just a piece of analysis showing the days that it started.
So I understand that. I get your point. But my question is so, we've got people who take a lot of Fridays off or a lot of Mondays off, if that's what it reflects.
Lots of Mondays, not many Fridays.
Yeah.
They don't start their leave on those days.
Yeah, I get that point. But I think the critical issue is, in terms of financial statements, are the employee records being correctly reflected in the financial statements? So are we capturing the correct amount of leave records, i.e. amount owing to staff, or to a lesser degree sick leave, those sort of things? But that's really the question.
So we didn't find any issues around how systems were accruing leave and how the leave was going from HR systems into financial statements. We didn't find issues in that space. I think it's a question for every entity as to whether the leave records are actually reflective at a point in time of the leave that has been taken. If you've got a pile of people that haven't put leave forms in but have already taken the leave, your leave balance will be overstated. If you've got people that haven't been at work and haven't put a leave form in, your leave will be overstated.
So it is about, you're not 100% convinced that the leave records are correct.
We purely did analysis on the data. It is for each entity to have a look at what assurance you've got over how accurate those records are for your entity.
So in respect to the benefits of position papers, because I know in a government sector, there's a big emphasis on position papers. In terms of leases, as an example, I'm not totally convinced of the power or the efficacy of and the benefits of doing position papers on leases, as an example, because I'm not convinced there is a massive difference between agency A lease versus agency B lease. And we put a lot of time and effort into writing these position papers, where in reality all we're doing is putting in place and applying the standard.
So I think that's where the finance guidance was particularly helpful this year, but you might be surprised at the wide variety of leases that we saw, particularly in the past 12 months. There is actually quite a wide variety of leases and lease conditions out there.
Right.
Yep.
Okay.
Thanks. Mine was more an observation than a question, but as it's coming from a small agency, we've had to waive the excess leave this year because I don't know about anyone else in any agency, but no one's going anywhere. No one's taking leave. Everybody can work from home. And in the future, I'm just interested if anyone has the same problem, that no one's ever going to be sick again. And there's 6 weeks of school holidays coming up, and absolutely everyone's able to work from home. And COVID has proven that. And there's a huge issue as well around, well, you know, I didn't have a good time at home during COVID. Excuse my French, I worked my arse off. And I'll be honest, people with small children, which I don't have, were working till midnight to try and do their hours. And like, as a small agency, we have the flexibility, but I'm sure big agencies didn't. So I'm just wondering, if you do that audit again over the next 3 years, you'll probably find very high balances. And I honestly, like, it's got to the stage where we've said you have to take leave, you know, and I'm personally not keen to go anywhere because I need a plane. It's a really, and the future is going to be really tough, and we're going to end up with very large leave balances, and again with small agencies. It's a huge issue.
Agree.
But it's more an observation than a question.
Yeah. And it's a wellbeing issue as well as the large balance issue. Is, I know we've been encouraging all of our staff to take a break because they're exhausted and they need a break. So we're trying to find ways to deal with that.
Can I just say something about that piece of work? That piece of work, to me, is a thought provoker for agencies as opposed to let's whack around those three entities. And it's data that you hold in your agencies all the time. So one of the questions I'd ask myself is, should I do a bit of poking around in that space? Because the data itself and the sort of charts that, and you'll see more of them in the report, it tells a story about taking your eye off things more so than anything else. And yep, CFOs will worry about what it does to the provisioning for employee expenses, etc. What it tells you as management is there's patterns of behaviour that might be affecting productivity. So you can narrow it down to what's my job as a CFO, should it just be about the expense itself? But as a management executive, one of the questions it should tell you is, are there patterns of behaviour here that are affecting productivity? In the last department I worked in, we worked out, and it was cost recovered, most of it, but we worked out how much we were losing in productivity in slabs of behaviour like that. And we put a management drive in to actually address some of the cultural issues and behavioural issues that were there, so that you, in these times of tight money, get your bang for your buck. So some of it's not so much about the agencies itself, it's about what the data you hold, it's all your data, it tells us about both the compliance with the rules frameworks that you put in place, but what the patterns of behaviour are that actually create expense in your entity. So I'd encourage you to have a look at it. If you want one of the team to come and give you a quick presentation of it with, say, your HR head or something like that, There are some significant control watch points in there for people in the policies that you have. On the leave thing, I think you've got a real issue. We've all got a real issue about whether or not the excess leave thresholds are fit for purpose in the current environment, and that's a really good management discussion to have. I also think we've got to be quite vigilant about whether people are working from home. Or whether they're doing something else. So the sick leave question, if you're sick, and used to be if you're sick, don't come to the office, shouldn't it be if you're sick, take the day off? Because we don't want people working when they're sick. So I think we've all got to go through some sort of mental mind shift about what work looks like in this diverse environment, and have a conversation about what's happening, what our data's showing us about excess leave, excess flex, all that sort of stuff, and how we're going to manage it.
The thing about sick leave is that in the old days, people came to the office with a runny nose and
soldiered on.
You soldiered on because there's lots of indispensable people in the graveyard and we all soldier on. But nowadays, you're stopped at reception, your temperature's taken, and depending on where you've been, you're asked a list of questions. And you're actively discouraged from coming to the office. But if you've got a runny nose and a sore throat, most of us can work. And that's the issue. Like, I actually can work, I'm just not allowed in the office.
Well, again, what I'm saying is, how do you shift the mindset that people really should take a day off and get better in 1 or 2 days, rather than continue to be unwell for 2 weeks? I think there's some really, really interesting policy grappling issues for management in these things, and we're grappling with it too. Somebody worked out if you do this with your mouse every hour, you look like you're still on. So we monitor when people are on, and if you do this, you're still on. The best thing you can do is video Skype them and see if they answer within 3 rings. Look, we're supposed to have a break a little while ago. What is your preference, to grab a cup of tea and something and sit down and keep going so that you can get back to the ranch? Yeah? All right, why don't we just take a few secs to grab something, use the bathrooms, and then keep going?
Okay, do you need a signal to start streaming again, Maureen? Yeah, okay. Okay, welcome back. So I'm Lisa Rowder, the Group Executive Director for Performance Audit at the ANAO. I'm just going to give you a little bit of an overview as to our year in performance auditing in the ANAO, some of the lessons that we've learnt that I thought might be useful to pass on to US CFOs, and some of the products that we're releasing into the sector. So this year we're on target to deliver 42 performance audits, which is the same as what we delivered last year. Our normal KPI is around 48, but as some of you would know, we have some budget constraints in the ANAO. But we've also taken on the request of the Finance Minister to do performance statements pilot, and so that's affected our, even though we're still producing a product, so to speak, it doesn't count towards that KPI. So we're sitting at around 42. We also produce insights products, so they're not the better practice guides that we used to have, but they are a summary of some of the key audits that we've had. And we've had a focus on performance measurement. We're doing one at the moment on regulation. Service deliveries through other entities and procurement is where we're sort of looking in the next 12 months to publish new insights products. And then we've also got our 2 performance statements audits opinions, which I'll talk to in a little bit, but they're in the process of being finalised as well. So that's what we're producing in my group at the moment. So some of the common findings across the audits that we've undertaken over the last 12 months are listed there. But firstly, on performance measurement, that's probably one of the biggest areas, and it comes through in our performance statements work as well, that we think there's more focus that's needed generally across the sector. The areas that we think we need improvement are the evidence base. So what is that data? What is contributing towards that performance measure or that target? The link back to purpose and program objectives. So we're looking at performance both at the entity level, at the performance statements level, but also at program level. If we're doing a performance audit on a particular program or its effectiveness, we look at performance measurement at that level as well. We're also looking at the measurability. So do people come up with a KPI that can actually be measured with some reliable data? And that there's no bias in the data that's actually used and selected. Also means ensuring that you've got measures that help you assess whether the policy or program or the compliance framework that you've got in place, or your risk management planning processes, or your budget measure perhaps, is actually delivering on those agreed objectives. So how do you as an organisation know that? And that's really what we're looking for. Where agencies, I've got additionality up there, it comes up quite a bit. From 2 perspectives, the additionality of where an agency is funded to expand a program, so being able to measure what extra did we get for that extra funding, and that's often a budget measure issue, or where you're asked to go in as a government service provider and realise and meet a gap in the market that is not otherwise being provided, so providing finance, for example, to a particular sector of the market that can't access that commercially. How do you measure the additionality? How do you measure that impact that you've had that wouldn't have otherwise been able to be provided through the market? So yeah, you need a way of determining whether that service could have been accessed other than through your program. The other one is documentation. So document the basis for decisions. It's amazing how often we find that a decision is made and there's no evidence base. So something might have signed off, but there's no evidence base as to why they made the decision that they did, particularly where agencies are moving away from their own policies or frameworks. So if you're seeking efficiency savings, for example, in your organisations, how did you measure that actually got delivered? And the amount of time it's taking us when we go into agencies to locate records tells us that there's more work that needs to be done on record keeping. On risk, so we've had a bit of a focus on regulators over the past 12 months. We've done quite a few regulatory audits, which is why we're producing an insights product on that. And what we found is the compliance activity is not always risk-based. Agencies are not necessarily using all of the intelligence that's available to them to determine where the risks in the market are. And it also applies to other sort of control mechanisms. So risk management needs to reflect the use of and the extent of the regulatory powers that the organisation has to achieve the objective that's set out for them, usually in legislation. The next one is ethics and sort of stewardship of public resources, and Rona spoke quite a bit to ethics and the work that we've been doing in that space, and that has really come to the fore with the Leppington Triangle audit that we published during the year. So the focus is on the intent of the financial framework policies and guidance, not just the pure application of the rules. So what was intended by that particular framework, and was that intent reflected in the decision making that was made? So entity money, regardless of corporate and non-corporate, is taxpayer money, and we want to see evidence that it's been used efficiently and effectively always. The next one is governance structures. So they're put in place to provide your management or your minister sometimes with assurance. So if you're part of a governance structure, ask questions. Rona talked about the fact that as CFOs, if something comes up and you think it's a little unusual, you think maybe it's a little outside what you would normally do, ask the questions. And what we're finding is those governance structures are not asking questions, they're accepting information that's presented to them. And be fully confident of the information that's presented. If you don't have all the necessary information, ask for more. And the same goes for decision makers, making sure that the minutes that go to decision makers actually cover all of the necessary bits to inform that decision. Government agencies generally have got good governance structures. We're not really seeing major problems in the structures. It's just how those effective they are. Next one is value for money. It comes up a number of times in procurement advice and also in the use of consultancy reports. So agencies sort of get a consultancy report or review or an independent assurance review, and they sort of do it again, and maybe in a few years they do it again, but what we're not seeing is that they're actually taking the recommendations of that review and actioning them. And then they'll find in a year or two's time they get the same recommendations again. So get value for money out of those reviews and actually action them. We also want to see that value for money is considered not just in pricing, but it's obviously considered in capability, but all of those things are documented. And if the decision maker wants to step away from recommendations, that's obviously their imperative to do so, but document why and the decision for that. On the delivery of intended savings, so whether these be budget measures or other internal sort of strategy or related savings or productivity targets around enterprise agreement time, we often don't see full implementation of the actions that were sort of intended to deliver on those efficiencies. Savings generally are taken out of your budget at budget time, and so often agencies will say, there you go, we delivered our saving. And that's true, but what we actually want to see is that there's evidence that you've got a bit of an implementation plan, and you've got some evidence within your data to say this is how we realise that productivity saving or we realise that efficiency. Say, for example, in an audit we saw this year, there was a strategy to reduce asset holdings, which then can't be delivered for whatever reason. There should be a documented decision making regarding what are the alternatives or what are the implications of that, rather than just going kind of, oh well. Okay, so just moving on to our performance statements pilot. So we conducted and completed performance statements audits of the Department of Veterans Affairs and Attorney General's Department this year. We're in the final process of finalising that and presenting those opinions to the Finance Minister. So I don't want to go into the detail of those findings yet, but hopefully at our next CFO forum or at the sort of the community of practice group that we want to pull together, we'll be able to share a lot more detail around that. The performance statements audit, we think, is a really important part of auditing in this sector because, as you know, financial statements are generally very well evidence-based, they're robust, they're reliable, and we're seeing really good quality financial statement sort of production in the sector. We want to see that same level of quality and reliability in performance information that's given to the Parliament, and we think audit's got a really important role to play in giving that assurance, but also helping you identify where those gaps are that we need to meet those quality expectations. So some of the things more broadly that we've seen this year, is ensuring a clear read from your portfolio budget statement through to your corporate plan, through to your performance measures, and hopefully having targets against them as well. So it's fine to have a measure, but what are you actually aiming for needs to be presented as well. Where evidence comes from a third party, making sure you can actually get access to that data in a timely way to include that in your performance measures, or going back and going, we can't actually report on that measure, so we're going to change our corporate plan and change our measure, and you can do that because that data is not available, and change it to a more relevant measure. Targets I've already talked about. Qualitative and quantitative measures provide a more complete picture of how you're actually performing. Case studies, Rona mentioned the example of case studies in foreign affairs. They're okay if the material in the delivery of your objective is selected at the outset, and it's not selectively chosen at the end. That sort of helps you tell the story that you'd like to tell. Also, case studies can go well when they're combined with other measures as well, and they can give a good complete picture. Performance measurement capability building is important if we want to get this right. So you all come from accounting professions. There isn't really a strong profession of people in performance measurement and performance statements. So we've got to build that capability across the sector, as we do within the ANAO. So that's something that we need to start retaining people and building that expertise. Corporate plan, it's a living document. You can update it during the year if something changes, so that when you get to the end, you don't find yourself with some measures that are actually not relevant for you anymore, or you can't measure anymore because something has changed in the environment in which you're working. Using an alternative measure, but then explaining that change. So just like we use notes in financial statements, using your performance statement to actually explain some of those changes. The goal essentially of our push to mandate this form of auditing is to bring performance reporting and financial reporting systems and quality to the same standard, so that Parliament can rely on that full picture of how an agency is managing the funding that's been given to it. So the next steps in this process really will be in the hands of the Parliament to determine whether they decide to mandate this form of auditing, and we await, their decision on that. Either way, we will may return back to, we'll still do performance statements auditing, we'll just do it as part of our normal performance program. Okay, so this year we did publish an information report out of AusTender. It was our second report on AusTender procurement and contract information. The first one we did was in 2017. We published this one in March this year. Thanks to the capability that we've built in Bowler's area, which he'll talk about in a little, we were able to examine 10 years worth of data this time, which showed us a lot more useful trends across the sector. AusTender only captured contract variation data though from 2012-13, so some of our comparisons in that report are over a 6-year period. About 125 entities report on AusTender, so around 65 billion worth of contracts. But the remaining 34%, which is a pretty huge sector actually of the Commonwealth, are not required to report through AusTender. So the data that's reported in there is only really capturing sort of around 65% of the market. What we found through that report was that limited tender is still way more prominent than open tender. Some of that is fully justified. Other times I think it's convenient. So we really need to look at going open tender. That competition and value for money is really the intent of the procurement framework. Contract variations reducing in incidents in terms of the agencies are keeping to the scope and the value of their contracts, but there's still a significant amount of money going through contract variations. With the intent of financial frameworks in mind, more than half of all contracts have been reported as resulting from a limited tender rather than open tender, and 44% of procurements for contract notices were above the relevant thresholds specified in the CPR, so your 80,000 or your 5 million. In 2018-19, there were over 78,000 contract notices worth around 65 billion. 63,000-ish of them were parent contracts, 15,000 were contract amendments. So contracts are still being amended relatively frequently. Less than 9% of amended contracts were reported as being amended within 12 months of first signing the contract. So you're sort of seeing early variations for various reasons, but it's something worth looking at in your agency as to whether the full scope is actually being tendered for, and whether the variations reflect the intended scope of that contract, or really it should be another procurement. Around 42% of amended parent contracts had their value increased by more than 100%, and 20% of those were increased by more than 200%. So they're pretty major variations, which I think are worth questioning. And consultancy contracts, there's a lot of attention by Parliament on the use of consultants. We're around 647 million, so they're still relatively high. So these are the types of, I guess, these information reports are really important for us in informing our risk assessment of where some of the risks across the sector are in relation to procurement, and they help us determine where we might go and have a look in our performance audit program for the year. So our 2020 products, I've talked a little bit about insights, but the ones that we published over the last 12 months were rapid implementation, which we put out when COVID hit, to bring together those audits that we'd done before, which were really focusing on emergency response. I think there was, around flood response or other, where agencies had to do things really quickly, and what some of the lessons learnt in that work was. We found that was a really useful insights that a lot of people have given us some positive feedback on and had really good uptake on our website. We did another one on performance measurement and monitoring, and I expect we'll update that once we do finalise our performance statements pilot. We did one on insights of management of conflicts of interest and procurement activity and grants. So conflicts of interest come up a lot in our grant and our procurement audit, so that sort of brings together some of our learnings around that. And another insights on fraud control. So we did a series of 3 fraud audits. And that brings together, again, the learnings in that. But we found generally fraud control was relatively well managed in the agencies that we looked at. We've got a dedicated website page now for our COVID-19 related activity. We've got 5 audits underway on COVID. 4 of those will publish in December and 1 will publish in April next year. So they will be some good audits to have a look at if you have been involved in COVID, in terms of how agencies are managing the pressure of delivering quickly, but also documenting decision makings and putting good governance controls around what they're doing, and managing the risks, not just the risks to the delivery of the COVID measures, but the risks to the business as usual. And the other thing we've been doing is the assurance reviews of advances to the Finance Minister. They've been a monthly product to help track how that expenditure is being and whether that expenditure is in line with the government objectives. So just as a summary, what's been working well this year? So due to COVID, one of the really positive outcomes of that for us, and hopefully for you, is electronic access to records. So it reduces the burden on you because we don't have to ask so many questions about getting access to documents, but it reduces the pressure on us as well, in terms of we've got more fulsome access, and we can pull together our audit report a bit quicker. We're still finding a lot of poor file structure though, and use of informal filing, like people documenting decisions within emails, and it does take us quite a lot of time to work through those things. We've got some tools that help us do that a little bit quicker now, but good record keeping helps efficiency for you and for us. Performance audit is working more closely with our financial statements team. Rona already mentioned that Leppington came out of financial statements audit, so it can trigger the need for a performance audit to dig a bit more deeply and to go a bit further than where financial statements team already would. And we share the same information, so we're hoping that we don't ask you twice for information that financial statements have already collected. So information around your governance controls, your IT controls. We access that same information. And remote access to audit committees is been really useful and saving an awful lot of time and allowing both our financial statements and performance teams to attend those meetings. So that's working really well. So key takeouts for you from what we've been doing this year is, as I mentioned before, investing in your performance measurement capability. It's really important. It's going to be, I hope, a growing area of our work. Getting your performance people to talk to your areas about your controls, your evidence, how do you pull together that information and how do you make sure it's reliable. Being open in the provision of information to the ANAO. The clearance, sometimes we see in performance audits that there's a clearance person or a clearance process to give us information. It's really much quicker for you and for us if we're just given access to information and there's not a clearance process. We can access the information anyway, so there's not really a need for a clearance process. When agreeing to the recommendations, Rona already mentioned this, have a way to ensure that they're actioned and followed up, but also make sure that you're actually really agreeing to change something. Currently considering risks at the portfolio and sector level, and we're in the processes of pulling together our next year's audit work plan, and it will be a little tighter and more focused than in prior years, but again, we'll be looking again at performance measurement, we'll be looking at cyber controls, and we'll be looking again at sort of efficiency and effectiveness as we always do. So I'll wrap up there. I'm going to hand over to Bola Oyetunji to talk about our data analytics work, unless anyone has any questions.
I just want to add something to what Lisa said. Like, are you getting the performance statement thing bang, bang, bang? One of the things you've got to think about, so you've got enormous professionalism and capability, and we suspect from what we're seeing is that some of this is not a profession of performance measurement and whatnot. If the government agreed and through the Parliament mandated performance statement auditing, it's going to happen in the same time frame as financial statement auditing. So, because it's got to be audited for tabling in the annual report. If I was a CFO and this was potentially coming down the line, I'd want to make sure those people, or you in your double life, were well ready so that when you're in audit season yourself, you're not having to do too much in their space. The accountable authority is likely to say, well, you know how all this works. These auditors are in here, you all know how, and it could make your life a nightmare. So I'd be thinking about what are some of the learnings from my profession as a preparer of financial statements, an evidence gatherer, a reporter, and making sure that the other statement preparer has learnt from you before it happens. Because when we come in, if it's at the same time, now it's likely that we'll do one agency under the same audit leader at the same time this year to see how it works from an auditing perspective and to test how it works from the agency perspective. I just think we're giving you a huge heads up about readiness, I guess. And so if that's the one message you take out of here, making friends with that person and making sure that they're getting ready, not leaving it till when you're both under pressure, I think is worth doing.
Thanks.
Thank you very much. This is going to be a very short presentation, but what I can promise you is I've got a very strong team behind me. So if there's any request, I'm sure the Deputy Auditor General will agree that we can have that presentation to you. So my team, we support the financial statement audit and performance audit, and one of the things that we've done is for the effectiveness and efficiency of our audits. We now use and have the capabilities to use population data, and at the end I will give you some takeouts, which I think is quite important. For those who did auditing when you're doing your accounting degree, the way Justice Lopez in the Kingston Court Mill described the auditor, as far back as 1896, we're watchdogs. We're not bloodhounds. Some people may think we're bloodhounds, but we're not. But and it's to examine to see where human beings have made mistakes, the mistake we seek to find, and the mistake we seek to correct. And you see how we do that as you go forward. So I'm just going to, so focus will be on case study. So now I'll rush through a few things. So we have the strategy. I believe we have it on our website. It's 5 pillars. I'm looking at governance, looking at people, looking at technology, process that aligns with that methodology, and we also then have data, and I'll give you some of the expectations that we will be looking at in data as we go forward. So in 2018, the strategy started in 2018, we built capabilities. In 2019, we learned how to use data analytics in performance audit, and then 2020, we started embedding data analytics solution in financial statement audits, and 2021 will be a year where so if you've not seen any of our data analytics solutions, 2021 is a year where rolling this out to many of the agencies. Now that's just our process, regardless of your system, we'll capture it, we'll process it, we'll look at the integrity, and we use data analytics for both insights and assurance. Again, that just gives the picture of the process. What I want to draw out here is previously, even when you set up the testing, you don't look at population data for insights to drive even some of the insight through data discovery, because sometimes when you look at your data, as Rona was talking about in terms of compliance, audit, and HR, on the leave management, there are a lot of things in data which can actually help drive some of the solutions that we have. Again, so the case studies, again, I'm going to rush through them, but again, if you have interest, just let me know. So we've used data analytics approach to confirm completeness of accuracy of revenue. Again, this is where the normal ITGs we do did not work. They have what we call legacy systems, where controls could not work. They have different systems to capture information, bookings, observations. So what we're able to do is to combine the systems to be able to then solve the problems we describe here. So if you look at this, this is a classic process that we use, where we designed the program before COVID, and the impact of COVID, we could also actually capture it. Now, so the calculation of the revenue is very complex. So it depends on the distance of travel, it depends on the size of the aircraft, it depends on the airport, So again, all these variables are there where if you don't have controls over the system that will have done, in IT, it will take a longer time to do, some of the substantive testing that we ordinarily have done. So we use Python, to write the scripts, to provide the solution, and the conclusion we had was 99.9% precision, over data integrity. So we did this in 2019. By the time we applied in 2020, we actually saved about 50% of the audit cost. Again, so if you look at that quickly, the tip is that on Friday, Saturday, weekends, you have more flights, than Monday, and then we apply the different billing schedules and billing prices to determine what the revenue is. So once we do that, you could confirm $1.2 billion of revenue within 99.9% precision. There's no more thing that you need to do in terms of assurance. The second case study, I know I'm rushing through this, but bear me out. I think we'll have time to talk to you after if you need to. So we standardize HR, and luckily in Commonwealth, I used to work in New South Wales. Commonwealth HR, is so well organized. APSC asks for survey twice a year. It's one AGS where you move from one entity to the other. So we're able to standardize a solution where for this agency through using, I'll just show you the next slide. But what we did was to set the expectation, depending on your enterprise agreement, depending on some of the assumptions we make. And it could be, for instance, if you're an AO2, you've been in Commonwealth for 7 years, the assumption that you're on top of the band. So we don't use averaging or anything, just very precise. And for this agency, 0.24% variance, just shows that, yes, for the auditor, we don't need to do anything more. And that's the kind of things that population data can do significantly well. And that is some of the things we use. So for those who understand auditing, for you to do analytics, you need to pick what independent variable is. So outside the CFO group, I need to be able to go outside and pick the enterprise agreement, look at the bands, and be able to conclude what your payroll should be. So the first couple is what we do for financial statement audit. For performance audits, again, we use data analytics for effectiveness. So for MBN, so that was the criteria we're looking at. How to manage connection related complaints. When you move to MBN, and then again, just look at this as the MBN has different, this big organization, different system to capture different activities. So you look at what the connection is, you look at what the incidents are, and then there'll be different reasons actually, because one house can have more than one connection. There could be more than one complaint. So what we were looking for, was so the KPIs, is for formal complaints. What they mean by formal complaint is if you just ring in that I'm not happy with the service. The KPI is you need to solve that problem within 5 days. Then the complex, complaints will be the ones where MBN has to spend money, to resolve the issue, and that has to be done between 21 days. And the third one is if it's urgent. Urgent depends on the customer, financial hardship and things like that. That has to be done within 2 days. So the KPI MBN set for itself is that they must achieve 93%, within the SLA. So what we did, again, we combined the data. We looked at, so the conclusion of MBN was, so these are public information, that they achieved 93%, but they used Excel. So what we then did, was pull the three data sets together, and what we saw was that, look, you really did not achieve 93%. We're able to look, we segregated the formal complaints, to complex, to urgent, and we had, different, KPIs that we got through that. And what the importance of this, again, I'll talk about it in the takeaway, is as a custodian of the data in the CFO group, when you use Excel sometimes, I think one of it is, if you record the complaints between 9 a.m. and 5, Monday and 5 p.m., on Friday, you may actually, achieve, the target, the KPI, but we have a system where we use accuracy and completion. So if there's any dates that is missing, we can capture that, in the system, and that gives more effectiveness in the work we do. So, and this is my final slide, I've rushed through this, but, so what we're looking at for 2021, data acquisition, which is streamlining the data. For those who know, what's waste time for auditors is we ask for information and comes 1 week, 2 weeks, 3 months after. That's actually waste time, again, for resource allocation. We standardize, solutions that will run across different, FSLIs, and then we'll have data-driven, audit planning. Now, so what are the takeaways that I think is important? And I'll start with one of the questions that came through before in terms of procurement. Now, so we did a pilot, on supply expenses. And one of the things we're able to see, which again the agency really appreciated, was why is this, vendor changing bank accounts, 10 times in the year? Why do you have, some of these invoices, that the purchase order, was after the date of the invoice, or the invoice was, after the date of payment. Now, this in itself may not be, any problem, but it shows that the system may not be working as designed. That's one. The other thing is there's some of the controls that are captured outside the system. So sometimes, yes, you have the purchase order signed, globally, by the secretary, for the year and things like that. But at least the question will be, you know what is missing, and then you start knowing what you need to capture. So part of what you could do, start getting yourself ready to know what is actually in that data outside the control system. Now, it's also important to ensure that you have data maturity. And the significance of the data maturity is governance, in terms of security, in terms of protection. Do you actually know what data you have, how it's been protected? And again, there's been discussion before about cybersecurity. How do you get that, covered and protected? The second one is data acquisition. Actually, the second and third is about data acquisition. And the two things we're looking at, so we'll be coming and asking for more data, population data. So what we see is some systems, they don't even have, data tables, or the configuration, So, and maybe they were set up a while ago, but whoever set it up, has moved on. What are the links? What are the data tables? Sometimes is not known. And lastly, we'll be looking at opportunities for what we call quarantined hosting environments. And I think the Deputy General calls this the natural systems. The question is, why do we have to transfer data up and down susceptibility to cyber attacks, data storage? Why don't you actually have a quarantine environment in your agency where we can do the analysis? We can, depending on the classification of the data, we can leave the analysis in the environments you have, and you can actually use that. Just like Carla was talking about, the issue about staff leave. Why can't we leave that for you to actually start using? Again, there's some complications that we need to look at. Someone gets concerned about, the agency seeing what we do. We don't mind the agency seeing what you do. It's about transparency, and it's your data. So any analysis we do is about your data, and this is actually also improving, the data maturity in the environment, so that our audits will continue to be more efficient. So I'll stop here, and again, for those whether listening online or here, if you need more information, I've got a strong team that backs me that we can really provide that to you. Any questions?
So last call on any questions. Can I encourage you to read some of the stuff we've mentioned? Obviously the end of year report's the most CFO sort of savvy report, because it's got all the findings and summary, chapter 2 summary of the sort of year. Read it online, you can word search, it's much quicker. And look at your portfolio and your agency, and like portfolios, what's happening there. If you get a chance to flick through the Auditor General's midterm report, there will be something that's relevant to you in there, whatever it is. 2 sort of key strong messages, and I'm going to add a third one for you to take back to your entities. So getting ready for a world where performance information is more routinely audited is a thematic of today through a number of lenses, and the importance of your experience in informing that. This year, as I say, we'll be in a couple of entities doing it at the same time. We haven't seen opinions issue yet, so it's outside of the time frame at the moment, but the goal will be to issue the opinions within the same time frame. So there'll be experiences for people to learn there. I think the second thing I'd say is don't be shy to ask us just to come out and present at your agency. If you've got a regular SES meeting or a regular EL2 forum, or people will come and have a chat to you about key issues. Governance is a big one this year that we're starting to see through both the sort of 2 key audit types. The accountable authority REM stuff that you'll see in the report is an issue that should be on your mind. The procurement of stuff right at the top of the organisation, and who's keeping an eye on it, should be on your mind, no matter what your governance structure. The last thing I'd say, and Lisa sort of alluded to this in the sense of what we see out there, and having the some entities have given us 24/7 access to their business systems. That really makes our life easier and makes your life easier. We can extract data all day. We can pump it through forensic data tools. From a governance perspective in your entities, one of the biggest issues is record keeping. If you're in board governance and your board members are using their personal email accounts to move your stuff around, be very careful. They're going out into unsecure environments. So we've seen board members shooting stuff out to their home email address in Gmail that's sensitive information that belongs to the Commonwealth. We can go and find it, but you should know what's there in terms of the decision making in your organisation. Lisa mentioned that people are using email for decisions. That's fine if it gets filed. When we're digging around in a big procurement or a big grants process, we're having to use your unstructured data to structure decision making, and I would see that as a key risk for an organisation. If you can't reconstruct the decision making, you've got problems, not because of auditors, but because of the law under which the decisions are made, the Archives Act, etc. I'd bang on a bit about record keeping in my entity if I were you, amongst your peers, at your tables, because it's creating risk for you. We can manage it. It costs us a lot of money. We go and take terabytes of data and we crunch through it and reconstruct it. One entity this year asked us for the reconstructed data back because it was better than their record keeping system. That's a huge indictment on the public sector, that they say, can we have our data back the way you structured it because it's much better than our record keeping? Well, it is. I'd bang on about record keeping, not because auditors like it, because it's the law, and it's a really important risk management tool in your entity. If you'd like us to come out, chat to groups through our external relations people, just externalrelations@anao.gov.au, and we can organise that. But thank you so much for those of you out there. Thank you so much for those of you in here, and I wish you well. Thank you.